All righty. 1st of October. This and that. I promised to go through the remaining chapters, that is 17 through 29 of the Michael Hudson book. Not quite there yet. I had to reformat the thing so I could go through it and chop it down into summarizable pieces. And then I got distracted because, as you may have noticed yesterday, I introduced the syllabus for a course on geoeconomics that's being taught by Riofrancos at the, I think she's on sabbatical. So this is the University of Vienna course that she's teaching. But apparently, I think she got tenure. So because she's an associate professor now at Providence College. And when you see the kind of articles she's been doing and other sorts of careerist matters, I think you can sort of see why this is a good time for her, I think. Particularly in terms of getting exposure in Europe and in the field and blah, blah, blah. So if we have time today, I will look a little bit at 17, the Michael Hudson book. But as I said, after today, if I don't start looking at that syllabus thing and start excavating it for more articles, which I could do, I may do anyway, or I probably will do actually. It's very current, a very current syllabus. Now, to give you the larger picture, she introduces her syllabus for the course with an article that she, a chapter, so it's a book chapter actually, in a larger text called Rethinking Comparison, edited by two other folks for Cambridge University Press. And her chapter is called From Cases to Sites, Studying Global Processes and Comparative Politics. And she, well, let me give you the big picture of it. This particular chapter for her course explains her kind of methodological position, which is really important. Probably best to warn students where she's coming from. But when I got to the end of the article, it did seem to me that not only is she has a point, she has a theoretical point, a particular idea she wants to stress, which is useful but not fully articulated, which is fine. I mean, essentially, her discussion was also designed, I think, in terms of the project of the book, to also reference the other, which I thought was a very good
Very
approach.
bright light from me.
What?
Oh, sorry about that.
She was reflecting on her co-authors or the editors' other chapters, and that made it an interesting kind of commentary. An interesting book chapter and a good project, which is I think the way edited books like this should do more of, and I think it meets a kind of the encyclopedic needs of disciplines. So that's by lengthy explanation that what this particular thing I'm going to read a little bit from, but try and just simply overview, and you can read it yourself at your leisure, or it may seem difficult for some folks. It's a very fun read for me because that it goes through various theoretical positions on how you do certain problems or methodological problems in defining a field. And in political science, without, I don't know if Prof. John is here, but there are certain issues in methodological issues in political science that are that express a certain problem in both qualitative and quantitative analysis. The dominance tends to be in the field to certain empirical things to prefer the quantitative, because then you've got numbers and blah, 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 blah. But for those who do less of that, it doesn't mean that it's a lesser study. It's just that there are different methodological approaches to doing research. In this particular case, the author, Thea, has decided, and I think it's a reflection on her own experience doing her dissertation, that when you try and explain something in certain types of studies, you, particularly in a comparative way, her argument in this article is that there's a style of doing things. Some people do studies that research a number of cases, and the problem has always been how many cases is enough. Now, one case could be enough, but there's a whole set of demands about, well, one's not enough and two's not enough, and so what number n is enough? Or is the whole question of asking for numbers a problem? So that's how it kind of appears. And so she sort of, I suspect that when she was doing her dissertation, or whatever, going through it, she was hassled by people demanding that she do more stuff, and because the methodology required it, blah 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 blah. And I think she wanted to tell these people where to get off. And I think some people write articles because they want to tell other people off, and so this may be it. Essentially, what you're saying is, well, the whole point of view of the idea of a case is problematic in and of itself, and that you need to accept new kinds of methodologies to consider the whole problem of a case study. And the case study method is one designed and created by a variety of folks. And some people, will claim that, well, all I need is one case study or whatever. And I have you do enough side references and blah, 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 blah. Her position, Thea's position, I think, and you can correct me by reading the damn thing, is to suggest that there are a variety of methodologies that require a thinking as David Harvey did in his first big book, the difference between the ideographic and the nomothetic. That is, some things are normative by, in terms of a scientific laws or whatever, measurable, immeasurable, whatever. And then other things are ideographic. That is, that they appear in some position, some kind of structural position. They're historical. They have a certain place in a much more qualitative way. Qualitative does not mean subjective in that particular sense. A subject may exist, but the qualitative question is to situate it within a sort of series of methods. And in fact, historical research itself has that kind of issue. How much do you construct in order to get a thing in history, and under what criteria do you develop the ways in which you can to write an efficient and effective history? And without getting too far into the weeds on that, the important thing for her was, and I suspect that was the problem in her dissertation, but it wasn't a problem. I think that people would hassle her, I'm sure, about, well, you haven't looked at enough different cases across, because she did her a dissertation on lithium, lithium in a variety of Latin American countries. She's sort of a Latin Americanist, and so the comparative case, Chile, Ecuador, and a bunch of other cases, because a lot of lithium is going to come from there. I mean, there's lithium in the United States as well, but it's actually, with all due respect to colonialism and imperialism, it's a lot easier to get lithium from other places, simply because you don't have a certain lawlessness about it. And hence the larger question of her research, that is trying to make it relevant to a certain type of research, topical research subject, which what she did was she sort of, and it's very careerist, of course, you design your thing and then you make it essential to a whole bunch of other people's research programs. And so, she's connecting lithium to the demand for electrical vehicle batteries. And now this is a political science dissertation, right? But the whole it's very well crafted in that particular sense. And of course, she's a Latin Americanist, so it makes it fairly easy relative to communicating with people on site, etc. So that's the kind of thing that she's arguing in this article about the necessary, the geographical components of it, and that measuring things by virtue of measures like nation states, etc., is not very useful or problematic. So I hope you understand sort of what I meant in this particular. And I was, of course, reading between the lines in terms of some of her methodological needs. Now, what she's trying to do is sort of stake out a position where she can use this, the sort of her dissertation methodology, but she's expanded it in a way that addresses the larger subcategory, the subfield, on the issue of comparative politics. And there is a literature for this, and she addresses it, and she spends far too many pages, well, in my opinion, far too many pages at the front end kind of working through that problem. And of course she addresses the dominant figures in the field who scoped out the quest. It's sort of a literature review. Well, it is a literature review, and then she proceeds to push on for her own kind of thing. That's the reason why this is useful for her course, because it tells the graduate students, it tells students that, okay, this is my approach and this is how I, justify it. And so screw you if you don't, can't get into it, but here's my methodology. You better, if you're going to challenge it, get your act together, whatever. It's a little defensive on the one hand. On the other hand, is she's got a place she wants to stake out, and it's a useful place and very smart. And she already has tenure, so she can talk about Marx in this thing. And she actually mentions Fred Jameson. So, I mean, it's a poli-sci thing, but yet it already, has a little small section that will make people who are into Marx very happy. And it also has certain other sections that make certain other folks and other subfield components. You have to sort of write this way, and kind of that's what's going on. This is a very good example, I think, in terms of doing that kind of research. Anyway, careerism aside. So let me sort of briefly go through some of it, and then I think you'll see what she was driving at. The dominance in some non-quantitative areas of the field is this idea of creating case studies and allowing the case study to have a certain generalizable possibility for the rest of the field. And her issue is that, well, often you just assume too much. It's not a case study, or X number of case studies is still too problematic for a larger kind of set of questions that addresses the quote unquote scientific element of what poli-sci is, and that's sort of interesting as well. But that's best left to be fought out, I think, among political scientists. As a subfield of political science, comparative politics is often associated with the comparison of two or more independent and bounded cases. A case, in canonical textual definition in graduate student training, slides between two usages. Number one, an instance of a more general class of processes or events. Or number two, a geographically bounded entity, usually a nation state, but sometimes a city, empire, or province. Neither of these usages is adequate. The former presupposes the membership of a particular phenomenon in a pre-designated category. The latter imputes a bounded, enduring holism. Remember, Kamala talked about holism, and that freaked out Fox News. Holism on what are deeply interdependent and made and unmade scales of political life. So already you see kind of some of the issues, a kind of skepticism about it. The virtue of immersive inquiry is its potential to generate novel concepts and to classify events and processes in unexpected ways, which unsettles the first idea of the case. And such immersive inquiry often reveals the connections between political dynamics in one locale to dynamics that go beyond the geographic unit under investigation, thus unsettling the second. Drawing on my research and engaging in a range of methodological scholarship, I argue that the conventional treatment of case studies ignores, and this is the, something that will probably cause lots of arguments, their constitutive multiplicity. Now, I've used the word constitutive before, and there's a certain constitutive suggests, as I looked at weeks ago on the question of social ontology, is the thing that connects everything together. Your argument for a kind of wide range or terrain, contestable terrain of activity. Any one event, institution, or process may belong to more than one category of political life, and any one locale is cross-cut by and co-constitutes the problematic construction there, dynamics that exceed its geographic boundaries. Now, let me just stop here and say part of her commentary in here also deals with world systems theory. That is, Wallerstein, et cetera. So she brings all kinds of stuff in here. She mentions Annales, the French Annales school history, the long, waves, blah, 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 blah. She touches on all that stuff, which is, on the one hand, encyclopedic. On the other hand, it's a sort of base covering relative to your method. In light of this multiplicity, I propose citing as an alternative to the conventional approach. So already, the idea of citing, that is something on site or at a site, is a geographical reference that has a whole literature built into it, which is why I want to have us read Lefebvre at some point. I propose citing as an alternative to the conventional approach. Citing provides a framework to study global processes in the moments and scenes in which they unfold. So already you have a narrative question, drawing our attention to the co-constitution. That is, how is it that particular places and processes are all integrated? So co-constitution of particular places, which suggests a kind of micro approach, and macro processes, because she is going to talk about the global. My framework builds on Rajin and Sosa's discussions of casting, of casing, that is the making of case studies, which is a reference to the chapter 5 in the particular book. This thing is, her book chapter here is placed. The process of casing brings operational closure to some problematic relationship between ideas and evidence, theory, and data. So it's a big deal here. And on scale making, which is underneath the idea of citing something. So in general, she is rethinking the building blocks of comparison. This is the whole issue for the book that this chapter appears in, is this idea of, what counts as comparative, what's comparative about comparative politics. And comparative politics can be incredibly problematic, because if you take it too far, then you've got to, worry about, well, can I, do I have enough research skills to work in 2 languages, which is often the case, right? I mean, it's easier in Latin America because generally, Portuguese and Spanish, but let's say you were trying to do Ukraine and Russia, there'd be trouble. Anyway, from this perspective, cases are neither self-evident geographic entities, nor are they members of a predetermined class. Like casing, citing entails iterative encounters between empirical knowledge and theoretical knowledge. But my framework goes further, transcending the logic of cases altogether. So you could say this is the same problem that you could, if you're going to critique Jameson, for example. Jameson talks about, well, it's postmodernism is the cultural logic of capitalism. Well, that all sounds really good, but then you actually have to start making questions about the logic and what's the structural reasons why you can make that claim, et cetera, which, with all due respect, Fred doesn't quite do. So that's just me. Particular sites offer a view of the general, not because they're cases of it, but because they are constitutive of it, along with many other sites across the world. So what we're trying to do is, and the problem with case studies is that they tend to over isolate the whatever you're going to study, and neglect, with all due respect, the kind of structural relationship it has to the rest of the world. For example, the abstract structure we call global capitalism can be empirically observed by identifying its constitutive social relations, that is, wage labor, the profit motive, private property, the commodity form, and the particular context in which they emerge are institutionalized and are contested. As a corollary, we gain analytic and empirical leverage over abstract, global, and longue durée, that's the Nall's thing here, processes by conducting research in the sites where they are salient, observable, and conflictual. They're not, this is not the same thing. There's a difference between something that has salience, something that is observable, and also something that is conflictual. And you could say that there's actually historical and philosophical things that engage all of those things. And what follows, I first historicize. This goes to Fred Jameson about historicizing. The conventional comparative method, illuminating the conditions under which the comparison of discrete, independent nation states became the standard of scientific rigor. This engages a whole business about, historiography where, well, you become an expert in a certain, nation or whatever language group or area. And this, there's a whole set of underlying issues that come up with it. And of course, if you're in graduate school, you have to defend this with all the usual types. Understanding this history is essential to appreciate the contribution of citing as an approach to political inquiry. As I show, the development of the comparative method is bound up with the trajectories of global capitalism, imperialism, and geopolitical conflict across the long 20th century. Now, that's there's a reference to the long 20th century, which has its own narrative. Yet the conventional approach to comparison faces its own global context. Well, whatever. Citing, therefore, it's a way to acknowledge and analytically leverage the always global character of political inquiry. After recounting this intellectual history, I then zoom in on the status of single cases within this hegemonic approach to comparative inquiry. So-called single cases are instructive, given their ambivalent status in a field defined by comparison, because they reveal the key assumptions underlying the goals and criteria of research. And this is the key point, the most important point relative to a certain type of positivism. On the one hand, they're deemed especially suited for key methodological tasks, such as hypothesis generation or explaining unusual but important historical events. So there's a literature for this, which can, reflect on a certain idiographically unique or isolated sort of a thing that from which you might be able to generalize and create a hypothesis, etc. The social science is filled with all of these methodological things, some of which, resemble certain types of scientific method, others which are peculiar to social science, that is hypothesis testing. And she goes into this about, type 2, type 1 errors and a bunch of other things that would be intelligible to the usual political science person. And they're seen as more likely to meet criteria such as conceptual validity. And there's a whole thing about that if you can make something sufficiently strong at the conceptual level, it will overcome all the issues about falsifying, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, they're regarded as an insufficient foundation for the conventionally accepted goal of social science inquiry, generalizable causal inferences. That's the mother lode, the gold standard for social scientists. That is to be, and this is the question we ask of Marx: generalizable causal inference. And yes, Marx does that as someone trying to do a kind of social science, right? He talks about the Corn Laws. He talks about poor people. He talks about workers, that's all there. It's all there. People may complain about it because it's fragmentary and blah, 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 blah. But he does try to address all of these things in the construction of, let's say, a critique of political economy via capital. So anyway, back to her, Thea. I suggested this, for example, blah, 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 for example, see E.P. Thompson's History of Working Class Consciousness, E.M. Wood's, Ellen Wood's account of the capitalist transformation of the English countryside, Carl Polanyi, we've talked about Polanyi before, on the conflictual emergence of market society, Eric Williams on slavery, and the development of capitalism. Scholars in the tradition of world systems theory, so this is the Wallerstein thing, who analyze the violent incorporation of territories as the peripheries of, this is the center periphery argument, of capitalism, and studies of the privatization of land and commodification of social life in neoliberal Latin America. And this is the kind of current state of Latin American studies, because it's the dominance by neoliberalism with privatization and commodification, and it's beyond the center periphery thing, which is mentioned in the prior sentence. The big thing, the kind of enemy that she's critiquing, because I would assume that this is probably how she did her graduate work, is to try and work through King, Kihane, and Verba of 1994, identify causal influence as the goal of inquiry. This, cause and correlation are the real problems that always sort of infest social science. You have to construct your arguments in such a way that you can argue, for a certain degree of viability. And as discussed later, argued that the greater the number of observations, which is distinct from the number of cases. Already here, you're making setting up a difference between how many observations you made for your particular research and the number of how you've constructed instances or cases. Unless you think that cases is like a artificial and kind of a stupid thing to construct, the entire business curriculum, of course, of the Harvard Business School is a case, is case driven and has all of its unusual methodological issues, but not unrelated to it, and we're confident in our inferences. Disciplinary ambivalence is a product of a misconception regarding the nature of single case studies. Single cases are not single, but rather marked by constitutive multiplicities. That's an interesting argument there. But I go further than reconceptualizing the case. As I've discovered in the course of my research, casing remains bound by the assumption that the phenomena we study are valuable only insofar as they serve as examples of something else. Instead, I argue for selecting research sites that are co-constitutive of a broader process of interest. So already she's making a certain kind of structural question that there's something shared, co-constitutive of something that I'm going to research that, connects them all. And I'm going to look for not necessarily, identities, but similarities or something under which you make the comparisons. I illustrate the methodological and substantive value of this approach with reference to my research on the global energy transition. That's the kind of front end of her research. That's why lithium's important. That's why electric vehicles are important. That's why comparing various colonial sites for resources, mineral resources, is important for her research. So global energy transition defines this larger path that you could describe. Most of us who try to do some variety of eco-socialism, are essentially concerned with global energy transition because we're trying to move from fossil fuels to renewables. That's the front end. The back end, of course, is the how much exploitation, expropriation, and imperialism and all that other stuff happens because of it. I conclude by encouraging graduate students and junior scholars to work against the grain of comparative politics and embrace the intellectual rigor and creative potential of the site-specific inquiry, a genealogy of the comparative methods. Comparative methods exist in a significant number of fields. So, for example, in the art historical context, a comparative method does allow you to help determine the authenticity of a particular artwork, and you do this by comparative method, largely because of iconographic comparison, um, iconological comparison. But as those fields have changed, people are using infrared and X-rays and all kinds of other scientific things to help move the argument forward. So it's not always simply the skill of the scholar as in interpreting and validating a kind of authenticity or connoisseurship, but rather it is comparative in that particular sense. You need to compare drawings to the original and studies and drawings done by followers and imitators and plagiarists and whatever. Okay, back to the back to Thea's article. In methodological handbooks, graduate and undergraduate seminars, and the obligatory methods section in journal articles, the comparative method is presented as a means to the overarching end of social science inquiry, that is, producing inferences that are generalizable across space and time. And that's the whole point of it, right? That's David Harvey, that's Karl Marx, that's Engels, inferences that are generalizable across space and time. And lest you think that that's unimportant, before I came on here, I was watching for an hour, even though it was a torturous hour of Anwar Sheikh doing the second part of his lecture that he started last week on his research using IRS data and World Bank data to show, and without oversimplifying it, he essentially deals with income data, global income data, that is as measured by big institutions, big data. And his point, of course, is not simply to analyze it, but actually make a certain argument about class. I mean, ultimately, this research, and Sheikh may not get to the end of this little research program, but he's got an army of graduate students, as I mentioned before, and the army of graduate students is going to be out there trying to work with what is standard empirical data and try and prove that, well, there is a class struggle. My God, and it's not proved because the Marxists have added this magic to it or secret sauce, but it's right there. It's measurable. The data of income and difference is actually pretty solid. The problem is, of course, the nuances of this, but if you look at it as big macro, big data sort of thing, it's there. Okay, back to Thea's article. This logic links a number of methodological operations, and she lists them here: theorization, conceptualization, operationalization, hypothesis generation, case selection, identification of dependent and independent variables, data collection, data analysis, and hypothesis testing. There are some canonical texts in social science that have been used in a variety of cases, and combined. These are the kind of things that fields, particularly social science fields, gets presented with in the larger question of so-called social inquiry. So social science has all of these things built into it, and the problem, of course, is deciding on whether your particular project, your research project, addresses a sufficient number of these things, and is viable, blah blah blah, and the usual power politics applies. The hegemonic status of this logic is only reaffirmed by the debates that take place on its terrain, upon which interventions assume that comparison is a route to generalizability, and therefore that every step of comparative inquiry should be structured to obtain this desideratum. Overlaid on this understanding of the goal of comparative inquiry is a highly simplified understanding of the quote-unquote scientific method thought to govern experimental work, wherein the isolation, control, and manipulation of variation is the sine qua non of producing general knowledge. Of course, this goal of using comparisons to generalize has a history. a history that is crucial to understand and appreciate the theoretical and empirical value of shifting from a logic of comparing cases to a logic of studying sites. Now, you could say, obviously, one is more abstract and the other is a little more concrete, more specific in space and time, blah, blah, blah. So you could see already she's making a ideographic versus a nomothetic kind of comparison here. The comparative method carves up the world into discrete cases, abstracts those cases out of their mutually entangled histories, and then brings them into commensurate relation with one another. As I discuss in the next section, the further disaggregation of cases into observations unmoored from their conjunctural interdependency and divorced from historical time takes this analytic operation to extreme. So one of the problems that you can always imagine relative to a social science, particularly in the case of field work, is, the bias of the observer. The problem, the whole question of doing in a particular study and during a particular space and time is to try and, work through, well, I did this in this particular case, and it does, verify at one moment the kind of historical argument that's been created here, even though that historical argument could be, totally manufactured, which cases happens in certain fields. Those things are problematic, and I, without getting too crazy about it, anthropological things are kind of like that. A lot of archaeology has that kind of problem. Certain cultural analysis has that kind of problem. In art history, the simple but tedious example is, of course, well, there was all this writing about the Renaissance and late Renaissance artwork, and it has all of this great interpretation and description because it all looks so kind of dark and foreboding and blah, 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 blah. And then, of course, more recently, in the last couple of decades, the Sistine ceiling gets cleaned, and all of that malarkey about dark brooding and blah, blah, blah is irrelevant, because they sort of, once you clean it up, it's actually quite bright and, not foreboding, not whatever. It's just, and yet the greats and the interpretive greats in the field are, you sort of relied on these sacred texts, the canonical texts that say, well, blah, 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 blah. This is the way in which we can interpret the psychology of the artist, and that's just worship. So anyway, back to the point. For those of us trained in conventional social science, studying the sites that constitute and are constituted by macro processes requires unlearning this mode of inquiry. So note that she's trying to make a step here, and it's an important methodological step to resist the sort of dominant, the hegemonic position of the field. And the first step in unlearning is reinserting methodology back into history. As it turns out, the comparative logic is itself a product of and protagonist in the world historic processes its application tends to disavow. That is, this is partially the world systems argument. Imperialism, racial capitalism, and geopolitical conflicts. The comparative methods, in other words, is itself a fruitful research site to understand the co-constitution of knowledge and power over the long 20th century. Now, just that sense itself has a long, deep, and stupid history that goes into a variety of different methodological kinds of things, Bruno Latour, blah, 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 a whole bunch of other things. As a strategy to render social phenomena intelligible and predictable, the logic of comparative inquiry emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in a transatlantic milieu marked by a series of interrelated macro-social transformations. That is, capitalist industrialization and the spread of market society, the growth of state bureaucracies, the consolidation of national identities, and imperial conquest and domination. It's all of those things. It was this last process that most decisively shaped the origins of the comparative method in sociology. Rather than an internal reflection on the experience of capitalist modernity within the metropole, even using the word metropole signifies a whole bunch of other things, Victorian era sociology primarily applied the comparative method externally to the rest of the world, as seen from the synoptic point of view of the imperial gaze. There's a whole bunch of things suggested by this, and she does a thing in here where she's talking about sociology, and maybe I'll skip that because perhaps you're bored by these things, but it deals with the question of what has happened in certain fields, as I just suggested in art history. Meanwhile, it's Jessica Blatt's, I think she studied with Blatt, interdisciplinary history reveals a racialized understanding of political development constituted the primary concern of early 20th century American political science. Racialized typology and the comparison, this is the whole business of civilizing the world. That we're out there civilizing people, savages and all that other malarkey. They enabled issued from Eurocentric ideal types against which the rest of the world was less evolved, backward, or deviant. The whole problem of primitivism, for example. Thus, the conceptual boundaries of the taken for granted unit of comparison, the nation state, effaced the always ready global character of both social science theory and the imperial states in which they were developed. Okay, in the case, for example, of Germany, as I've mentioned before, perhaps, and some of you probably already will get bored by this comparison, but the fact is that a whole body of canonical literature in German art history, art history developed in Germany, let's put it that way. For example, the arguments about primitivism, etc., were derived not from anyone doing field work or going to Africa itself, but rather just looking at objects taken from Africa and generalizing from there. And so there's a whole bogus set of theories that, derive from this sort of misinterpreted or imperialized view. And, and much of the sadness, perhaps, in the art historical context is, the interpretations persisted, and it created, this awful kind of colonial, imperial kind of approach to field work and interpretation. And yes, it spills over into archaeology. During the interwar period, American sociology turned inward, as exemplified with the Chicago School's model of urban sociology. Well, and without getting too crazy about it, the idea of Chicago School stuff is to, sort of do field work, serious field work, and to really engage the advantage of being in Chicago, with due respect. And political science assumed the task of globetrotting comparison under the rubric of modernization theory and armed with ever more sophisticated quantitative methods, I think. And then there's a little side note here on Fred Jameson about the link between uneven capitalist development and conceptual categories of facilitated comparison, the modes of production argument, which Jameson is taking from Althusser. Skipping ahead, echoing the 19th century imperial gaze, although now inflected with the sense of uncertainty and urgency that permeated the Cold War era policy and research establishment, political science sought to expand the territorial reach of its analysis and dutifully enlisted in the battle against communism to export Anglo-American institutions and civic culture. And lest you think that's unimportant, there actually is a Republican-supported Institute for Democracy that is funded by the Republicans and sits in Moscow somewhere, and which is the host for a variety of GOP Congress critters to show up in as though they were kind of the advanced, the avant-garde for whatever democracy or something. And the reality, of course, is that they're just got co-opted by the Russians. But anyway, the geopolitical and conceptual partition of the globe into three worlds further reinforced the contours of Cold War era political science. And yes, it did. Like a division that structured the world into friend, that is the first world, enemy, the second world, and contested terrain, the third world, also marked an academic division of labor. And that, yes, that has persisted. Anthropologists studied the inescapably unique cultures of the not yet modern third world, whereas sociology, economics, and political science studied those countries that could be located somewhere along the teleological trajectory of modernization and therefore conform in greater or lesser degree to the quasi-natural laws governing modern societies. This is taking, Weber, Schumpeter, etc. From this comes the mutual opposition between studies that produce knowledge of specific cultural systems, the ideographic, as I mentioned before, versus those that produce knowledge in the form of generalizable laws, the nomothetic. Now, that's a dichotomy that is oversimplified. In fact, I think it's German actually in origin. But anyway, just take that for granted for the moment. This binary is almost exclusively deployed to denigrate the knowledge produced by single case studies, which are presumed to be inherently non-explanatory, no matter what its twin terms are archaic vestiges of 19th century German debates over the status of general theories in social science, even as the specific content of modernization theory has ostensibly fallen out of favor. Its goal of a total science and its positive epistemology continue to shape the methodological contours of political science, as well as privilege certain objects of research over others. Beginning in the 1970s, in comparative sociology and comparative politics, the search for timeless laws of modernization, themselves a projection of an imagined Western past, gave way to a historical approach to the study of capitalism, the state, regime type, and social revolutions. You can see, the new left, this is one of those little effects. A new canon coalesced around Barrington Moore Jr., Theda Skopel, Charles Tilley, and others, yielding an approach equally defined by its substantive and methodological orientations. For these studies, where the number of cases fell below the threshold for statistical method, comparison became a marker of social science rigor. For example, in his influential article in the American Political Science Review, Leifart framed the comparative method as second best to statistical analysis when there are too few cases to perform a regression analysis. Key to what Calhoun refers to as the gradual domestication of historical sociology was the emphasis on comparison, specifically John Stuart Mill's methods of agreement and difference as a route to generalizable causal inference, etc. This as the refers to this as the Scopolian moment, and its relative success can be seen in the strong association of comparison and conception of the nation state as the unit of analysis, which is pretty much the dominant thing still, as well as the understanding of comparison as a distinctive method in logic rather than a dimension of a variety of logics of inquiry. The hegemonic status of the method of structured comparison is perhaps most apparent in the conventional treatment of single case studies, which seem to defy the maxim that the more cases and the more observations, the more generalizable a study's findings. So, I may have already baffled you with all this, but essentially what she's attacking is certain canonical positions on, how social science operates. There are certain dominant views that become canonical, and sometimes become parodic. Margaret Mead, Mose, Levi Strauss does those kinds of things in certain fields, and in other fields, Anyway, maybe I've yacked too much. Let me stop for a second because I'm probably approaching the end time. Yes, I've approached the end time. We're up to, there's something we want to do at 6 o'clock. And I'll stop right now unless there are any serious questions. I don't know if I should stop and then reinstitute the live stream, or we should flip over. Is Larry here to make that shift? Larry?
I'm here.
Yeah, weren't we supposed to do something at 6 o'clock?
Uh,
I don't know if Joe is awake to do
oh, yeah,
the People's Forum thing.
right, yeah.
I don't have the link for it, and should I get off of share and then we just swap into? Well, we don't have to record it, do we? We just can go participate, right? Is that what the plan was?
Yeah, it's like a Zoom, sorry, a YouTube channel that's, just watch it. Let's
Um,
see.
considering my bandwidth issues, can you go find that? Is that possible? Can you do that, please?
I'm copying the link from Discord here. Just a sec.
Oh, yeah, well, let me just stop this for the moment. See if we can find it and then,
Oh, yeah, it's in the chat here farther up as well.
bear with us, folks. Trying to open Discord. Here it is. Book launch. Is it site? YouTube? Let me put the link in the chat in case my connection bombs out.
Okay.
Oh, it's not available yet. Okay, so I can go here, book launch, share sound, optimize. Here we go. All right. Can people see this?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Will I leave the live stream? Why don't I leave the live stream? Because it's we don't need to live stream it. I mean, it's on it's on YouTube. Crap. Wait a second.